Death, that terrible and inevitable consequence of life. But as the Foundation discovered in the aftermath of Project Dammerung, its absence can be even more horrifying than its presence. Let's bring you up to speed, shall we? Here's the story so far. After the death of Overseer 05-11, the SCP Foundation's infamous O5 Council learned the horrifying truth of what happens to human beings after death. There is no afterlife, no everlasting paradise or eternal damnation. Instead, the dead are cursed to remain conscious, aware of everything happening to them after passing, even their bodies decomposing. To combat this, a member of the Council, 05-4, established Project Dammerung. This was an internal Foundation-backed endeavor, created with one singular goal in mind: to capture and contain death itself. As part of this project, researchers created a machine known as SCP-3448. At first, it seemed like just an ordinary MRI machine from a hospital. SCP-3448 had a number of anomalous modifications made to it, giving it a rather unique function. The device was capable of separating someone's consciousness from their body, putting them in a sort of half-dead state. While in this state, a subject placed within the machine, referred to as SCP-3448-A, could maintain a consistent line of two-way communication between their disembodied consciousness and the Foundation. Instead of deploying a member of D-Class personnel, one of the SCP Foundation's own agents was placed into SCP-3448. Agent Anthony Michaels was elected to act as SCP-3448-A and serve as the conduit between the living world and the endless nothing that lies beyond. But as often happens when people dabble with forces they cannot possibly understand, something went awry. Project Dammerung's mission to contain death took an unexpected turn. When Agent Michaels was placed into the machine, things ended up getting much, much worse. Buckle up, because we're about to dive into the ill-fated outcome of the death-defying Project Dammerung, the catalyst for the end of death itself. One of the components connected to SCP-3448 is a monitor. This screen is used to interpret the electrical activity of SCP-3448-A's brain once they have entered the half-death state, known as SCP-3448-1. This component of the anomalous MRI machine is able to intake these electrical signals and interpret them as images, occasionally with words accompanying them too. During his time in the machine, Agent Michael's brainwaves were able to deliver some rather interesting imagery to the Foundation researchers. A number of these seemed to be a bizarre and seemingly disconnected series of images, almost like something taken directly out of a dream, hard to find any real context for. The first was a human figure, surrounded by a swarm of buzzing insects. After 43 minutes, the monitor connected to SCP-3448 showed this figure looking swollen, as if it had been stung by the insects, which flew away as the obscured humanoid collapsed. The next day, the screen showed a man lying alone in a desert somewhere, with an oasis in the distance. Almost like the classic mirage, someone dying of thirst sees just out of reach as they stumble through the endless sand dunes. The same day, the image changed to a man in a fetal position, in a room made of dirt with bones and roots protruding from the walls. So far, the dreamlike images coming through from Agent Michael's half-dead mind look strange, almost like the contents of the infamous videotape from the horror movie The Ring. Did any of these images mean anything? And if so, what? Was the man, the human-shaped figure appearing in them, Agent Michaels himself, or some kind of representation of his disembodied consciousness, now that it had been separated from him by the SCP-3448 machine? One of the Foundation's researchers described the imagery seen on the monitor as being akin to watching someone's acid trip for over a week. However, the same researcher also theorized that because Agent Michaels was being held in a half-dead state, that the other things appearing in the images with him could also be similarly half-dead. The researcher believed that what they were seeing was more of an abstract, conceptual representation of death, not a conventional afterlife, like the idea of walking up to the pearly gates or the fire and brimstone of hell. So the researcher decided to try half-killing objects, partially disassembling things and placing them into SCP-3448 with Agent Michaels. Sure enough, doing this meant that the man in the images now had whatever object was put into the machine. For example, when they broke apart a lighter, it appeared in the man's possession on screen. Unfortunately, this was the biggest mistake that the researcher could have made. The images on the monitor began to show the man, now believed to be Agent Anthony Michaels, being attacked by a little girl. Thought to be a manifestation of the very concept of death, this girl was seen stabbing the agent with a femur, torturing him while the Foundation were sat watching, powerless and unable to help. The researcher requisitioned a handgun, partially disassembling it like the lighter in order to arm Agent Michaels against his attacker, and it worked. But the consequences were unfathomable. Sure enough, Michaels was able to draw the firearm and fend off his attacker. The agent fired off a shot that, over the course of more bizarre, creepy, and disjointed images involving skeletons and teddy bears, seemed to hit the girl square in the head. The image that followed showed Agent Michaels standing alone in a garden, flowers blooming as dead insects rained down around him. On the ground beside the agent was a stuffed animal, a crow, with a bullet hole through its head. Shortly after, the following words appeared on the monitor attached to SCP-3448. "I hope you enjoy your hike, Dad." For a few short moments, nothing seemed to be all that different to the Foundation and the outside world. The researcher who had provided Agent Michaels with the handgun was trapped in a state of shock for a brief while, until 5 minutes later when the phone calls started flooding in. The first came from Joyce, a woman known to the researcher who frantically explained how her father, who had been dying, now was totally fine all of a sudden. The researcher couldn't quite tell if she was happy or terrified by what seemed to be happening. Next came the orders from above. The Overseer, 05-4, the only council member aware of Project Dammerung and who had backed it financially, called to congratulate the researcher and the rest of the team behind the project. It seemed that Dammerung had been successful in the goal they had set out with, to contain the cognito hazard known as death. 05-4 demanded that all records and information regarding the project was to be incinerated, covered up from the rest of the Foundation's knowledge. But the truth was far, far worse than any at the Foundation realized. It soon dawned on the researcher, who had been documenting Agent Michaels' time in SCP-3448, that Project Dammerung had not succeeded at all. They hadn't contained anything, hadn't secured the conceptual form of death. What they had done instead, by foolish mistake, was neutralize death. They had killed death itself, and now the world as they knew it was gone, changed almost indefinitely. Now not a single person in the world could die. They had caused the end of death. On the surface, a world without death sounds like a utopia, a blissful society where everyone on Earth lives a long and prosperous life. But those with a little more foresight will know that peaceful immortality for the human race is a fool's dream. Think about how many people there are living in the world right now. The overall global population grows exponentially every year. While death might be a sad and somber part of life, it is unfortunately necessary. Even with all the deaths that occur worldwide every year, the resources of planet Earth are still being stretched thin. Water, oil, food, electricity, homes, everywhere you go, there are plenty of people who don't have enough of any. So what happens when people don't die, just keep aging infinitely? What happens when the Earth becomes too overcrowded, when the number of people overshadows the number of resources even more than it already does? Society as we know it across the globe would collapse. And that's exactly what happened. The Foundation had done the unthinkable. They had vanquished the very concept that takes us from being alive to being deceased. But there's a reason Kilroy J. Oldster called death the great equalizer of human beings. It is meant to catch up with everyone. Every person born is ultimately destined to die. And by removing that element of human mortality from the equation, the SCP Foundation had unknowingly pushed the world towards disaster. With the actions of Agent Michaels within SCP-3448, death as a concept ceased to exist, almost instantaneously, as if someone had flipped an off switch. People didn't become undead. Things that had long since passed away and been confined to 6 feet under the dirt didn't start clawing their way back up to the surface. We aren't talking about a zombie outbreak. This isn't Dawn of the Dead. Instead, human beings across the world just refuse to die. Their brains continuing to function and bodies continuing to age, despite any damage or injuries they sustained. Fatal wounds were now just as dangerous as getting a broken ankle or sprained wrist. The concerns about how undying humans were overpopulating the planet were also extended to animals too, which were also affected by the end of death that Project Dammerung had triggered. As a result, the threat of starvation on a potentially global scale was greater than such a concern ever had been. Of course, the SCP Foundation left the concerns of a potential humanitarian crisis to those in charge of world governments. The United Nations could worry themselves over how to feed and care for a population that simply won't die. The Foundation had bigger fish to fry. Their mistake had caused this situation, so only they could undo it. The only solution they could come up with? Figuring out new ways of killing people. The Foundation wanted to bring death back to the dead. Their experiments began with the use of D-Class personnel, commanding them to attempt to kill one another through various means. Strangulation, both by hand or with the use of a belt, didn't seem to work the way it should have, with the D-Class being strangled, likely going into a coma due to a lack of oxygen to their brain. Not dying, but living in unconscious agony. In a similar experiment, placing a D-Class in a vacuum led to burst blood vessels, impaired motor functions, widespread paralysis, to name a few forms of damage. But still, death could not be achieved. Cutting, blood loss, poisoning, starvation, shooting, even decapitation of multiple D-Class personnel all yielded the same result. In some sense, simply allowing these subjects to die might have just been kinder, if death was still possible, that is. The Foundation even went as far as removing the brain of a live monkey, placing it in a blender, and testing to see if there was any electrical activity present. And wouldn't you know, it was somehow still alive, at least as far as life can be measured by human beings. This key part of our existence, the underlying fact of death itself, was no more. Removing that was like taking a crucial element out of a circuit. The world just didn't function in the way it was supposed to anymore. What hope did the Foundation have now? What could possibly be done to solve this colossal mistake? Well, the answer is very little, apart from waiting for the inevitable collapse of society. What awaited was a world in ruin, where everyone was starving but nobody could die. A planet and a people just hanging on until the universe eventually blinked out of existence, so that maybe then they could rest in peace. The moral of the story? You can't cheat death, because death isn't the other player, it's the game itself. Now go check out Secret Group That Runs the World, SCP-05 Council Explained, and SCP-006 Fountain of Youth for more videos about attempts to cheat death and its not-so-pleasant consequences.